Global economy in flux, prospects remain dim. What a wonderful IMF-esque title for the World Economic Outlook report in October 2025. I mean, they call economics the dismal science, and then they name the report Global Economy in Flux, Prospects Remain Dim. I mean, if anything could be more telling than that, what could be more on brand for an economist than a report titled that? Favor, what's your thinking on that?
Over the years, I think I've become like a huge fan of economists. So you're not going to see me bashing the IMF report. I love the name. I think it's very fitting for the content of the report.
Well, I think it does fit the general mood, right? Which is, we thought things were going to be terrible back in April. Um, they're not quite as terrible as we thought they were going to be, but they're still not great. If that's sort of a summary of what the IMF have been trying to communicate, that's my take from it. Yasmin, is that along the lines of what you were taking away from the report?
Okay, yes. I think the report covers a lot of things and was very interesting to see people's like perspective of what's going to happen globally and what actually happened. So yeah, um, good points and very interesting from my end as well.
So, if we put conspiracy theories to one side, and there are many conspiracy theories on the IMF, what the IMF are actually about is to come in when a country has got into trouble. So the country has got into trouble from one way. Either it's spent too much, either it's losing its reserves in its central bank, it doesn't have enough reserves left, and the IMF are sent in to help with the cleanup. Uh, it's a pretty dismal job, to be honest, right? And you have to then support countries to get back on track and to really be able to get out of that mess and start going back to growth again. And usually that involves a whole host of unpopular things like austerity, structural reforms, privatizations. A lot of the time, lots of things which are really unpopular to be done in a country. So when the IMF do their World Economic Outlook report, it's the voice of the resigned. It's the voice of it's almost like a sigh should be let out as they do this, like, oh, like, you countries, what are you doing to us? And I feel like that's what's coming through in this World Economic Outlook right now. There's a whole host of things where there's almost like a sigh at the start from the IMF, and okay, here, because they know that if things don't get sorted globally, they're going to be called in. They're going to be the doing all the unpopular things that they get blamed for and all the rest of it. So I think this is a really nice report for us to do a bit of a deep dive on. And I think, Favor, where should we start? Let's really start to unpack this. Where should we? Well, before we do, let's start on the overall economic growth outlook for the WEO. What is it saying?
I think I will never be able to unhear the IMF report sign for the rest of my life. Anytime I read it, I'm going to be hear them sign. So yes, so they had projected 3.3 growth in 2024. Then this year is 3.2, and of course it's been revised, but 2026 is looking like 3.1. So those are the numbers, and yeah, I'm hearing some big size, but I'm sure that as we get into the report, our audience will get to see it's not all dim and gloom. There's actually hope ahead.
All right, well, let's start looking at some of the things, some of the reasons why they think it's growth is a little bit lackluster. Growth is not really taking off, and the global economy is not headed on the fast track to prosperity and everything looking good, right? And one of the key issues they talk about is protectionism and the increase of protectionism, right? With our friend Donald Trump in the lead on this globally, pushing this from the US side, a return to a system of beggar thy neighbor, of our country first, and how that plays out globally, which historically has always led to periods of slow growth, sluggish growth, if not recession, depression, things like that. So the US have started off, we will protect our workers, we'll protect our jobs, America first, all the rest of it, MAGA. Um, and that's had a potential ripple effect across the world. But one of the things which the WEO is quite interesting on this topic is they said, well, we thought it was going to be really bad back in April, back when all this saber rattling, all this rhetoric, strong rhetoric was coming out from the White House. But actually, it's not been quite as bad as we feared back then. And because a lot of it has been that the way countries have responded to that saber rattling hasn't been a complete locking up of everything. It's that by and large, countries have responded in a way which has protected trade much more than could have been the case. So in that sense, there's a bit of a bullet dodged for the global economy on that, even though there was a very high risk back in April. Why does protectionism? Why does that hinder growth? Well, just the reality is, if you're trying to protect your local industries, right, you're putting barriers in place, whether tariffs or potentially non-tariffs, right? So that could just be regulatory restrictions, right? We are only going to accept this particular. If you're going to put your food imports into our country, they've got to meet the highest standards, and we're going to make those standards so high that you're not going to be. Most countries are going to have to spend a fortune in passing laboratory tests or whatever's required, right? That's what one sort of form of non-tariff barrier. Now, as somebody in the UK, where initially they're talking about trade deals with the US and potentially having to lower our food standards in the UK in order to take US exports of food or imports from the UK side into the country, I was a bit alarmed, right? Because when you go to the US, there is a sort of discernible drop in quality of food which you're eating, certainly to a European palate. So it was a bit of a worry, actually. But all these things constitute potential non-tariff barriers, and they can be used genuinely because you're trying to keep standards, you're trying to protect your citizens and all the rest of it. But it can also be used a bit to game the system, to protect your local industries, and you can raise that threshold to a level where other countries will struggle to get there. And if you look historically, that's often been a complaint from African countries when they talked about the global trading system, that maybe standards have been put to such a high level that they're not able to enter those markets with their produce because it's just prohibitively high. And sometimes that's for good reason, and other times it's for less clear reasons, and it can be more protectionist. But anyway, the more you put those non-tariff barriers in place, the more you put tariff barriers in place, which is basically the additional tax that has to be paid, or the charge that has to be paid for the privilege of being able to get your goods into another country. The more you restrict, the more you restrict the choice that your citizens have, the more you restrict the potential cost savings for your citizens, and the more you restrict your economy from being able to take off. Just to give you an example, Pakistan recently lowered tariffs in certain areas, and has seen an increase in imports, which sounds bad if you're against imports. But actually, a lot of what they've been importing have been capital goods, and capital goods being those sort of key ingredients to your manufacturing sector, right? So what that signals is, if it's raw materials, if it's capital goods that are coming into your economy and you're importing, that's because you're producing something, and you're producing something better. And so actually that could lead to more prosperity for them down the line. So this is a long-winded ramble to say the IMF are saying, look, protectionism is going to impact all our prosperity if we're not careful. And it's done through tariffs, like Donald Trump wanted to introduce for the countries he did not think were playing ball with him, or non-tariff barriers, which can be the more subtle measures on standards and the rest of it. And the IMF report is saying, we thought that was going to be terrible, but it didn't end up being as bad as we thought. Yasmin, what do you think?
So I think naturally human beings, like since maybe the caveman era, are just like survival instincts. When something is wrong, you tend to, oh, let me protect myself, let me protect my family, let me protect my close ones. So I think that's what most of the countries that set out these high tariffs were trying to do. It was sort of a fight or flight mode they were in. And although the problem here is that we as people work better if we work together, meaning if we trade with each other. I think the highest level of growth we've seen in any economic era is when people started trading. Trading has been around since like centuries, but flights and everything allowed things to be way, way better. So I do think that. And the problem with tariffs is and protectionism is tariffs are an economic mirage in the sense that tariffs look like they're protecting the domestic industry or the country imposing it. And in reality, they actually do hurt both sides. So for the country imposing the tariff, for example, US, like the US did, it creates this thing called supply shock. So when a country announces that, oh, we are putting on tariff, let's say maybe on China or something, so people, the consumers go to supermarkets and they buy goods. So they buy it in excess because they know that, oh, next time this is going to come back into our supermarket is going to be times two or times three of the price. So that supply shock boosts economic activity and revenue. So that's what the politicians cling onto to defend their narratives. They raise prices for consumers and producers who rely on those imported goods. Like maybe some immigrants. There's a very high Chinese immigration population in the US. So most of them rely on these goods for what they eat day to day. So they will just go and buy, and then the politicians will be like, "Oh, look, see, this there's an economic increase activity," rather than actually focusing on the problem. So for the countries that are being targeted, this story flips. It reduces the export demand, acting more like a demand shock. So one side we have supply shock, the other side we have demand shock. And companies lose access to major markets. So those companies that sell these things, that export these things to these countries are also losing. And products and their products are sitting in shelves and they have to lay off workers, so and they get slow investments. So that's the problem we're seeing from the country, that they are put they are putting the tariffs on. And the IMF's July 2025 update actually revised global growth declined by 0.5 percent points earlier in the year because of the tariff measures. That's a big sign of how interconnected the effects are. So even though the tariffs were partially rolled back later on, trade uncertainty remained high. And uncertainty alone dampens the confidence of consumers, investors, and it disrupts supply chains. Essentially, both sides lose. So the cost just shows up in different ways. So, favor, back to you. We've seen sharp declines in labor inflows as well, and implications of potential output and skill shortages. What do you have to say about this? And what do you think?
Thanks, Yasmin. And I think the reason why this episode is particular important to us here at Flywheel Economics is because we always say that policymakers should treat policymaking like gardeners. Their approach should be like gardening. And as a gardener, you understand that the steps that you take has so much effect on your garden, or in this case, the economy, because the IMF's report is based on the fact that different policies are being made. Just Yasmin and Richard just reflected on the trade policy. But now, moving to immigration, I would come from the angle that immigration policy, as a lawyer, it is a country's prerogative. It is your prerogative. You get to decide the laws that you want to make that you believe is in your best interest. Yasmin talked earlier about flight or fight. If you think, oh, how can I protect my own citizens? So it's within your prerogative. However, when taking those decisions, you understand that they tend to have so much effect beyond what you could even plan for. And so in countries in developed countries, we are seeing a negative supply shock because large amount of people in developed countries rely on immigration. They rely on that labor that comes in. And so when we are seeing stricter immigration policies like Donald Trump announcing on the H-1B visa earlier this year and increasing the amount, people are diverting, or they're making it more difficult for people to enter into these countries. What we have is less people coming into work. And I'm sure people will listen to this and say, oh yes, that means more work for our citizens. Yes, that is one hand. But on the other hand, what we see is that a lot of nations have they have a declining growth, age growth. So they have an older population. If you have an older population and you're having less immigrants coming into your country to work, means that there's now a gap, because people are getting old, they are retiring, they are coming out of the workforce. There's nobody to take their place. So that is where the trouble begins with this immigration policy. So
Yeah.
in addition,
Favor, just to
oh,
come in there. This is why I'm still waiting to get my fence repaired down in Cornwall in the UK. Right, it's an
you
area
see,
of the UK which is particularly high demographic of elderly population. It's one which has to bring in lots of care workers from overseas to take care of the aging population. Hospital workers, healthcare workers, care workers in people's houses, things like that. But fixing my fence isn't one of those areas identified of where you can bring workers in. So the fence is broken this time last year. It's still broken. It's on a waiting list, and it's going to be looked at in hopefully within the next year. Um, it's hard to argue because the money's sitting there waiting to repair that fence. It's hard to argue that that's good for the economy, that fence isn't being mended, right? And that I'm not spending that money on getting it fixed. I want the fence to be fixed. I have the money for it to be fixed. Somebody could earn an income from that being fixed, but there's just not a supply of labor. And it's hard to say why that's a good thing for the economy. So just putting a little very personal touch on your story there.
thank you, Richard. I need no further arguments. You've said it all. And just to say that this immigration policies doesn't just affect developed countries. For the developing countries, we know that a lot of remittance plays a huge role in developing countries' GDP. And so when we have stricter immigration policies, it means people can't travel to earn higher salaries in richer nations, meaning there's less remittance coming to developing countries. And I would want to go back to Richard at this point, because another policy that the IMF talks about as a reason for this slow growth is the decline in aid. And I know this is a topic that is very close to Richard's heart. So just moving beyond remittance, we are also seeing that aid flows drastically reduced in 2025, and it's not looking like it's going to be better in the coming years, and that is affecting growth. So Richard, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's another part of a trend of countries looking being very insular, looking inward, and forgetting that they're part of a broader ecosystem. That global economy is a global economic ecosystem that we're all within. And so it's very nice to think, right, well, I'm just going to pretend we're not in that global ecosystem, and I'm just going to look after my own people and all the rest of it. And then if every country does that, a bit like with climate change, nobody addresses the major issue and we all suffer. And that's what's happening with the economic ecosystem as well. Everyone's trying to look for themselves first, and the sum of everyone doing that is a weaker global economy, and it's one which doesn't have that resilience built in. The cut in international development assistance is just one of the ways in which that's feeding through, right? So if countries are saying, right, well, we need to look after our own people first. Why are we supporting people in Nigeria, which is one of the countries Flywheel Economics works very closely with, Pakistan, other countries? If they are reducing budgets in that space, then there perhaps is not thinking through what the read across is, right? So even though aid is a very small percentage of the budgets of both Nigeria and Pakistan, it provides a sort of technical assistance which can be catalytic towards economic reforms, right? It's not usually about paying money into people's budgets. It's not usually about resource transfer in that way. It's usually more about knowledge transfer, and it's usually about how to implement the economic reforms that are going to make those economies stronger in the longer term. With some countries, that's different. Some countries, international development assistance was a much higher percentage and was actually on their budget, right? So they needed those inflows to actually fund their budgetary expenditure, and in which case the reductions globally could have quite a big impact on their ability to spend and their ability to finance certain things. And look, yeah, it was quite horrific to see what happened just about a year ago or so. Was it a year ago or maybe earlier this year when USAID were cutting back on provision of HIV/AIDS treatment in places like South Africa and things? There was a shock to the supply chain as medicines that people were relying on had become reliant on were no longer available almost overnight, right? So these things have very real impact, and over time people build up other mechanisms, people build up other ways of doing that. But it's certainly a shock to the system. I personally believe that aid can have a transformational role in partner countries. So from my side, it's another it's another bad thing which is coming through. And also, people forget that the reason a lot of this international development assistance is happening is not just as a sort of charity benevolence thing to other countries, but it's also very much in the own interest of the countries that are giving it. Right. So if there's instability in a certain country, which happens to have huge populations, diaspora populations that belong to that country, that's a real impact that hits home in countries like the UK, right? If Nigeria is unstable, then there's such a big Nigerian diaspora population in the UK. The UK will feel that one way or another. Pakistan, likewise, it will feel that ripple across. So it's not just a sort of, well, there's a moral obligation or there's a it's in it's in countries' best interest to make sure that all countries are sort of stable and growing and prosperous and all the rest of it. It's the global ecosystem point.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for that reflection. So, yes, I would now want to go to Yasmin because, Yasmin, you spoke earlier about the trade policies. And one thing that is coming out of that is that there's so much uncertainty because everybody's saying, oh, I don't know what's coming next. I don't know what US is going to announce next, or the UK or China. And that is really affecting the growth as well. So, my question at this point, Yasmin, is how can countries begin to build that confidence when the global trade environment is so uncertain, when nobody's sure what can happen tomorrow?
Thank you so much, Favor, for the question. And I would just, before going into rebuilding confidence, I would just like to add a point that I was just thinking about while we're talking about the immigration. So I think there's a comparative advantage situation. So countries like the UK need help with their fence building. And then there's Nigerians, young Nigerians waiting for jobs. I think Favor can attest to the fact that the job market right now is very hard to get into. There are so many people and so little jobs to go around. So I think it's just a comparative advantage situation. Oh, you guys are looking for, things to be fixed, people are looking for jobs. So I think naturally it should, if there weren't issues of immigration and issues of aid cuts and issues of, oh, let me protect my country, let me do this, and politicians and their agendas, I think naturally it should just be that, oh, this person needs this, I have it. We both, at the end of the day, benefit from it. So, naturally it should just be like a connecting, like it just works out. But I guess, it doesn't. So let me go back to the question.
No, but just
Um,
to come in there, Yasmin, because it's a good point you make, right? And the UK used to have a very automatic mechanism to enable that to take place, right? It was
yeah.
part of the European Union, and those countries in Eastern Europe, which were typically at lower income levels to Western Europe, they were free to move into the UK and do any work as part of being a member of the EU. So if there was a problem that you couldn't get your fence repaired down in Cornwall, there was somebody in Eastern Europe who could automatically come across. They didn't need any additional papers or anything like that, or any visa or whatever. There was no control on that side or restriction on that side. It automatically stabilized. And when the Eastern European countries joined the European Union, there was a big impact in the UK in terms of there was a quite a big flow of Eastern European workers to the UK, particularly in the construction sector. Lots of jobs that there was an undersupply of labour for. It sort of evened out. So if you want to see where that works and when that does happen, it's from that side. But it does stir up deep political unsettlement, right? So it becomes particularly in poorer areas of the country, or places where people feel like they don't have the same access to opportunities, or they don't have the same, there is a sort of resentment that can come across, and this is like, hey, why am I not getting the opportunities? And there's somebody else who's come in and they've done this, or they're undercutting me. I needed more money than what they offered to do it, and now I've got to lower my prices, and that's that it impacts on that. So that we can't escape the politics of this, whether it's trade, whether it's immigration, whether it's international development assistance. There is politics here. And even if the economic right answer, or the economic prosperity answer, may be, oh, well, you know what, immigration is good, a more open trade policy is good, international development assistance can be good and can be beneficial, that doesn't take away the politics of all of this. And in the same way, in our own lives, we're free to choose, make choices, even if they're not necessarily in our best interest. The same way countries are able to choose, they can decide, okay, we don't mind foregoing some economic growth in order that we have fewer immigrants in the country, or we don't mind foregoing economic growth to have a more restricted trade policy to benefit certain groups in that country, or whatever. We can argue the rights and wrongs of it, but it's how the political system plays out. Yeah, so I guess that's it, right? So there's a sense that we can choose to be poorer. That is an option that's on the table, and it's one which countries surprisingly choose a lot more than you would think.
Yes, it's almost like unbelievable that like someone would but I also think that when the country is choosing to be poorer, it actually only affects like middle class also. But anyways, let me go back to answering
Well,
the
let me
question.
come back on that, because I think that's another good point, right? So a lot
Yeah.
of the time, these things are these effects are not very direct, right? So a lot of the time it's never really presented to you as like, do you want to be poorer, but you'll have fewer foreign immigrants in your country, or do you want to be richer and you have a few more immigrants in your country? It's never really framed that way, right? It's framed as usually half the story or partial part of the story, or whatever. And there are genuinely winners and losers with some of these things. So let's not pretend, some groups, some demographics are more impacted than others by more open trade, more open immigration. On the budgetary side, with international development spend, there are trade-offs in terms of, do you put more money into your health system, do you put more money into your education system, and so there's a continual tussle on that. So I'm not pretending like there's a clear right answer all the time on things, but the subtleties in some of these things, in terms of what the economic impact of going the certain route is, that clear to people when they're electing politicians, when they're going to vote? No, I don't think it is always clear. This is why some of the economic arguments around staying in the European Union were very far away in people's minds when they were voting in the referendum, because it's hard. It's hard to show how these things filter through. So just to say, not all the time when people are sort of choosing to be poorer is it because they actually thought they were going to end up being poorer from it. Sometimes it's just the implication of the policy choices that we make.
So Favor asked, how can we rebuild confidence in the global trade environment? So, like I mentioned earlier, the fight or flight mode. People are hearing there are tariffs everywhere, taxes everywhere, different economic decisions are being made overnight, and that's scary for anyone who earns money, for investors, for companies. So how can this be restored? I'll just mention 2 points that I think should be implemented in order to restore the confidence that is being lost. So people need predictability. People need to be able to sleep and wake up and know, okay, this is where the economy is heading. So that's the main thing. The predictability is in there. People are not sure of, oh, what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen the next, because leaders are waking up every day and making economic decisions that affect people, affect their lives, affect their businesses, affect their lifestyles. So predictability is the first thing. It's going to, if we store that, we're going to have economic growth. And the second thing is we need to set out clear rule-based policy roadmaps. That means that countries need to move away from one-off tariff announcements, like I said, and towards more transparency. Like Richard mentioned earlier, there are certain things that are framed in a certain way. Like the politicians don't come and say, "Oh, we are going to close off immigration," but they will mention that, "Oh, now you can't fix your fence anymore," or now there are certain things that cannot be done anymore, and it's now so politicians need to be policymakers need to be transparent. We're making this decision based on this. I think it's something we've even seen in Nigeria with the full subsidy. So a lot of Nigerians didn't understand why, where is the money going to. A lot of, even this whole new tax reform, I think Favor can back me up on this. A lot of people still don't understand. There are no clear rules. What does this mean for everyone? So it causes chaos and it causes fear. And when people are scared, they tend to want to protect themselves. So the second point would be modernizing trade, especially as we're moving towards AI and everything being more digital. Outdated regulations limit productivity gains. I think Nigeria should also maybe make point of that, with e-commerce and digital services now being a huge share of global trade. Aligning data standards, digital payments, and intellectual property rules could unlock a new source of growth even as physical trade slows down. So I think as they were calling off, oh, tariffs this, tariffs that, people could still make money online. So I think that also gives people a sense of confidence, knowing that okay, this is going on physically, but on the internet or digitally there's e-commerce going on. I could do this and I could do that. So, in short, confidence grows when policies are predictable and rules are modern. The two combination will help rebuild trust in the system and keep trade functioning as a driver of global stability rather than a source of volatility. So, yeah, that's just where I'll stop. And, Favor, am I supposed to ask you a question? Okay. So, Favor, back to you. Um, So this report discusses how pressure erodes have hard and policy credibility and undermines inflation expectations. So what do you think?
Thanks, Yasmin. I think I think it's a good point that your question is coming just right after you talked about policymakers being more predictable in the kind of rules that they make. I think that was IMF's point exactly for the World Bank and for the central banks, rather, saying that it is important that central bank keep their independence. So we don't want anything like political pressure. The central bank is not anybody's playing field. They are supposed to be an independent organization, independent institution, because the job that they do is so important. They are in charge of monetary policy. And when central bank says we're going to hold the interest rate, or we're going to hold inflation at such and such rate, investors will have confidence. If a central bank has been known to keep its word, if a central bank has been known to be independent, credible, and free from political shocks. But if a central bank is always quick to save its government, or bring it, um, or adapt to, or allow itself to be influenced by the whims and caprices of the government, then we have an issue. And that is exactly why the IMF was calling for continuous independence of central bank institutions. And I think, using Nigeria as a case study, the central bank is doing well this year. They have really come with trying to unify the FX rates, and also the other monetary policies that they have introduced. So investors' confidence has already begun to grow. They are beginning to nod their head and say, okay, yes, this central bank they mean what they say, and they are doing exactly what they say they will do. But IMF was also talking about the fact that we shouldn't get comfortable with the gains that we have made so far. Say, oh, we're doing so well. It doesn't matter if we shift a bit. This is the time to build. We have this momentum. We shouldn't relax. We should keep moving forward. And thinking about investments, another concern that we have is with AI. I think, Yasmin, you spoke about it briefly, but when a lot of investors are moving based on what they believe AI is going to do, this brings us back to what happened in the early 1990s with the dot-com boom and then bust. So it's another caution that IMF is calling. But I'm going to throw to Richard, because no shade, but I'm pretty sure he was the one that was alive then, so he can give us more input into what exactly happened in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Oh, thank you, Favor. So I can confirm that I was alive in that time period, and yeah, it's a sobering thought that there may be people on this podcast that were too young, or maybe not even around in that time, maybe. But oh goodness, yeah. So if I go back a couple of years, when AI is just breaking out on the scene in a major way, right? So what was that? That was probably 2020, 2023. Maybe that was 2023, right? When AI really starts to play a prominent role. Um, the questions start being asked, okay, is this going to be the big productivity boost that the global economy needs? Is this going to be the game changer, which means that, because if you get productivity gains, that's where you get economic growth from ultimately, right? So that you have fixed labor. If you have fixed labor, you have fixed capital in terms of machinery and all the rest of it. Then what's going to be the big difference that drives your economic growth? If you're not increasing labor, you're not increasing capital, it's your productivity. It's how efficient you can be, right? And it's clear AI has made many jobs much more efficient, right? It's enhanced what we can do. Not to say AI is perfect or a great substitute for traditional methods of doing things, but I mean, I've seen it in my own work that things that would have taken me several hours before take a fraction of that time now. Thanks to AI capabilities, it can't solve every problem for you. It can't substitute for everything, but it can increase productivity in meaningful ways. But I guess this comparison then comes in with the dot-com bubble, right? To what extent have we got overexcited about AI and we've gone all in, and there's companies with the OpenAI and others who may have lots of very strong investors going into them, but have we got overexcited about it? And is the actual long-term impact of AI not going to be quite as big as the markets were initially thinking? And lessons from the dot-com era are there to haunt us, right? Where initial excitement about the internet, initial excitement about internet companies, a lot of companies that had a lot of hype and a lot of attention, but didn't really have a core business model that could generate revenues underneath them. They had a lot of investment in the early stages, but didn't have that pathway to being financially sustainable longer term, and people lost a lot of money. And there's a slight concern, okay, to what extent is there a bit of a bubble in the technology space again around AI? And is there going to be a correction, which means that the bubble bursts, or there's a drop, which means that people who've invested at certain levels lose money? And to what extent could that potentially have a ripple effect on the global economy? I don't know, Favor. I gave you a bit of homework around looking into the 90s and the dot-com boom. Was there anything that surprised you from that?
Yes, there was, because the internet boom and bust was twofold. On one hand, a lot of investors lost a lot of money, and then unemployment climbed. The unemployment rate in the US climbed to about 6% by 2002, and that's not to even think of the fact that the crash was up to 78%, the market crash. But at the same time, there were some companies such as Amazon, such as Google, such as eBay, that were able to ride the storm, and their influence on the economy has been felt. And so, if we want to draw a contrast to what is happening with AI, hopefully, we are not hoping to see such large numbers of crash, but there is need for caution. The businesses that are being invested in, do they have an actual model? Because a lot of times when we have something new, the temptation is to throw away the old, to say, oh, let's forget all about business model. This is going to change our lives. Old business is good business because they serve as solid foundation. And so with this AI boom, it's still important for investors, for businesses, and for the world in general to look at those essentials when investing, not just to get carried away with excitement. As Richard would say, there are some things that shouldn't be a matter of the heart, but a matter of the head.
Well, on that excitement side, Favor, I mean, look, think about what happened during the COVID period, right? Many people who were in jobs, in office jobs, were forced by the restrictions, the lockdowns, and all the rest to work from home. And for a lot of us, working from home increased substantially. And when things eased in the pandemic and you were able to go back to the office, a lot of people didn't want to necessarily go back to the office again. They're like, no, working from home is more convenient. I don't have to have a commute. I don't have to waste time talking to colleagues with small talk. I can just be efficiently doing my work, and I can use my time for more valuable things for me. I don't need to have all these kind of, interrelationships with people and all the rest of it. And for a while, and companies themselves were saying, look, this makes economic sense for us. We don't need to have a massive office anymore. We can have a much smaller office, and we don't have to pay so much rent, and people can share, they can have no, not everyone has to have their own desk in the office and all the rest. And you get that for a time period where it feels like the world has suddenly gone remote, and then it corrects again. And then companies start coming in and saying, no, we need you to be in the office a minimum of 3 days a week, or whatever the policy happens to be. And people start realizing the value of having that human interaction, being able to have those chats at the water cooler, and the way that ideas are shared and all the rest of it. So you have a sort of tilt to one extreme because of circumstances. You have a sort of people think, no, let's go all in on this model. And then you have a recalibration right to the other way. And people say, no, everyone must be in the office and all the rest of it. And of course, the reality is you end up with a sort of hybrid, don't you? You end up with something where some tasks are better to be done remotely, some tasks are better to be done in person. And of course, situations determine also the degree to which that's possible. And I think that's the same with the with technology as well, right? So everyone may think the AI revolution is going to be there for everything until AI lets you down in a very major way. We even look at driverless cars. Like everyone is excited about the technology until there's a crash, and then everyone's like, no, 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 we need to limit this and all the rest of it. And so it's just calibrating expectations about where the technology can really add value, where it can really make a difference, and using it appropriately, and not just thinking it can work on everything, everywhere, all the time. And we're humans; we get excited about things. We go all in on certain directions, and sometimes there's the reformation, there's the counter reformation, there's the things come into a certain balance after a time. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that's my thinking on it, Favor. And I think with AI, we're learning what it works well with and what it works less well with, and the technology is still advancing very fast. So I'm sure there'll be a whole host of different adjustments as we go.
Thanks, Yasmin. Thanks, Richard. So this has been an interesting conversation so far. And my final question for you both is, if we could pick just one immediate and critical action for policymakers globally based on this economic outlook, what would it be? So I'll go to Yasmin first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, very interesting conversation. I really like this episode. So, if I had to pick one immediate action, it would, just like I've mentioned before, it would be for policymakers to restore credibility and predictability in how they manage the economy. So I did mention people were scared of just waking up and, oh, what's new? Especially like as Nigerians, I think there was a time that the government was dropping everyday new policies. Today you would wake up and there was a tariff hike for electricity. Tomorrow there's another new tax. So people were just scared, like, oh, what's next, you know? So yeah, just credibility, transparency, predictability, and in the reports that we're discussing so far makes it clear that what's really holding growth right now isn't lack of capacity. It's not that people can't make services, goods, whatever the growth in economy. It's that there's uncertainty from tariffs to trade offs to shifts and cuts in aid, all these things. And we also mentioned like AI coming in, even though that's not really a barrier. But yeah, so just there's just uncertainty. The global economy feels like it's constantly reacting instead of planning. What we need are clear, consistent trade rules that don't change overnight so that people can budget, people can save. Oh, this money is going to be for my vacation in the summer. And then something happens, and then now suddenly I have to keep this money. People don't even have like disposable income anymore. So and people need to have money for different things, for like I said, disposable income, for saving, for when emergency happens. And independent central banks need to focus on keeping inflation low and predictable. Like I mentioned earlier, removal of Nigeria's fuel subsidy is a perfect real world example of credibility, predictability, and communication, and how that affects economic confidence. We've seen this play out clearly in Nigeria after the removal of the subsidy. While the reform itself made physical sense and created space for investment in health and infrastructure, the way it was implemented, like I think he announced it on the day of where they sworn him in as president, right? Yeah. So um there weren't any adequate buffers or communication, transparency. Where is this money going into? We don't know. It caused short-term shocks, inflation. There were lines at the petrol station. Just things were just affected. Food prices still does, and yeah, inflation pressure, public distrust. So it's a powerful reminder that policy isn't just about what you do, but how you do it. Predictability, transparent reforms, they all help to maintain confidence, protect the most vulnerable. Predictability doesn't mean rigidity. It means that creating a steady policy rhythm that lets household, companies, investors plan ahead. And in the language of flywheel economics, it's about keeping the ecosystem balanced so that the momentum builds naturally, not through shocks and stop cycles. So yes, that's what I would add to this. What I think needs to be done to restore confidence globally.
Thanks, Yasmin. That was really insightful. Over to you, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Favor. Thank you, Yasmin, for your thoughts. Let's take a step back. The World Economic Outlook. Go back again to the title of it again, and I love this title. It's so on brand for the IMF, right? Global economy in flux, prospects remain dim, and like I love the IMF. Like, you're not going to find many podcasts where people start saying I love the IMF, but it's like, don't ever change. Please don't ever change. We need you. Like you're the friend nobody wants but everybody needs. You're in the party. You're the designated driver. You're the grown up in the room when we're in a world of Donald Trumps and Vladimir Putin's. We need the sound dismal scientists of the IMF more than ever as the sort of stabilizing factor. They're the lender of last resorts. And this report just reflects so much on brand for what the IMF is in a world of craziness, of madness, and all the rest. It's the sober voice saying, "This is what you've got to do. This is the cost." What Yasmin was saying about predictability, what we've all been saying about the importance of predictability, that's all been so key to global future global prospects. There's the old adage, capital is a coward, right? So money does not come in when people are when there's uncertainty, when there's lack of predictability. You don't get investment, you don't get the growth that then creates jobs and leads to prosperity, right? So capital is a coward, and when the global environment is in such flux, how can you get that prosperity that you need? So if we go back to whether it's talking about central bank independence, right? When you read the IMF talk about central independence and the importance of it, they are effectively saying, because what is the institution in most countries that is most like the IMF? It's the central bank. It's supposed to be the central bank. They are the lender of last resort in their respective countries to the banks in their banking system. And what the IMF do on a global level, at a national, international level, these central banks are doing in their countries by and large, right? And so when they say they want independence, they say we want the grown-ups at the wheel. We want the grown-ups in charge of this. Don't give us the mad politicians that are coming in with sweeping radical statements. We want the sober designated driver at the wheel. What can you do to give more power to the sensible people? What can you do to give more power and it comes across in the trade rules as well. They don't want knee-jerk trade rules. They want sober, rule-based things that you can predict, things that you can plan, things that you can invest on the back of. And so if there is one key message which is coming out of this report for me, it's exactly as Yasmin says. It's about predictability. How can we make this world a more predictable place so that um, we can start really planting the seeds for future prosperity? And until we get enough stability in that global environment, it's going to be very difficult to get that future prosperity that we all want and we all deserve. And so that's it. It's a sobering report, but it's very on brand and it's very valuable. Don't ever change, IMF. Don't ever change.
Thank you, Richard. You've had it here first. IMF, don't ever change. We love you just the way you are. I think for me, I would just want to go back to my initial statement talking about the prerogative of nations. It's their sovereign choice. But we have to understand that when you take steps, there's only so much that you can see, that you can predict. So when you're making a choice and you're saying, oh, this is for my country's interest, are you thinking about that only in the short to meet them? Are you thinking about long term? Are you thinking about 10, 15 years when you're no longer the president, or maybe when you're dead or something? So when taking those decisions that nations are currently taking, it's important that, do you have all the data? Is it just because of your own political inclinations that you're taking steps? Oh, this is going to please my party people. Or are you looking at data? Are you looking left, right? Are you looking at all data available to you and saying, from what I can see, this is the best step that we need to take? Because just going back to the tariffs, when it was pushed out, I know that economists don't usually agree on everything. There's so much gray areas, but I could say that 100% of economists were saying this is a wrong decision to take. So if the experts are saying this, it makes you wonder, what did the president hear that made him make those decisions? And that would just be my final reflection in today's episode. Thank you very much again, Richard. Thank you very much, Yasmin. This was amazing episode, and I'm glad that we got to do it because it's so on point for what is currently going on in the world. And especially as the year comes to an end, we just have a month left. I think it was really important for us to sit down as a team and just reflect and lend our voices to what I'm sure is on the minds of our listeners. So, our dear listeners, thank you very much for listening alongside us, and we are sure that you took one or two. We are interested in hearing your own reflections. What did you think? If you've read the report, did our podcast make you want to read the report in case you haven't? And when you do, and if you have already, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with us? Do you think the IMF should definitely change? Do you think Richard needs somebody to fix his fence? We really want to hear from you. So please leave your thoughts with us on social media. We are available on all platforms from X to Facebook and LinkedIn. Our handle across board is Flywheel Economics. Also, please go ahead to subscribe to this podcast so that you can get notified immediately we release a new episode. Thank you very much again for listening. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much, Yasmin. Until next time, this has been the Flywheel Economics podcast.